Welcome to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today we're talking about what to read and what not to read before your 1L year. Your Law School Toolbox hosts are Alison Monahan and Lee Burgess. That's me. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. We're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. Alison also runs the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review on your favorite listening app. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we'd love to hear from you. And with that, let's get started.
Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today we're talking about what to read and what not to read the summer before law school. So I think sometimes students think, oh, I should be reading casebooks and getting ready that way. What do you think about that, Lee?
Oh, I think that's a terrible waste of time.
I agree.
Yeah. You don't need to read casebooks until you go to law school. I think that's pretty safe.
Yeah, I think people should think about reading things that are interesting and inspirational. I mean, of course, it's great if you learn some things you can later apply to your legal career, your legal education. But by reading books kind of around the legal experience or the legal system, you're typically going to learn things and actually increase your interest in these legal issues that you might interact with in law school. And also, you know, the reality is not everyone grew up like you with parents who are lawyers.
That's
so most people really have no idea what goes on in a courtroom. And having been a clerk for a judge, I can tell you it's pretty interesting. And I certainly had no idea what went on. And that was even after 3 years of law school. So some of the books we're going to talk about kind of give you, in an interesting way, some of that background, just so that you're a little bit more situated, I think, in the legal world and have a better understanding of kind of the basics of how these things work without talking about, you know, do you know tort law?
Yeah, I think that that's true. And I'm a big fan of nonfiction.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that nonfiction can be a great place to start when you want to read books to kind of get in this zone for law school. So I think some great places to start are stories about famous lawyers and judges.
Right, you love your bios.
I do love my bios. So some of the bios that I think are great to read that were kind of more recent was My Beloved World, which is Sonia Sotomayor's.
Oh, that's a great book.
It is a great book. You and I both read that a few years back.
We did.
Maybe like 4 years ago now?
We
It's
did.
been a while.
Maybe we should do a podcast on it.
Maybe.
No, I think that is a really interesting book because it, you know, obviously her background is kind of not standard for a Supreme Court justice. So it's super interesting to kind of hear about her childhood. I mean, I feel like it's almost in the vein of Becoming, the Michelle Obama biography, and that it goes into her childhood. And, you know, her childhood is really not what you would expect. She grew up fairly, you know, not particularly well off in New York City.
In the projects, I believe.
Yeah, in like literally in the projects. You know, with a family that wasn't the type of family that you expect a Supreme Court justice at that point to come out of. And so it's really fascinating. And the same experience that Michelle had, where she goes into, I think she also went to Princeton, actually, goes into that rarefied world of the Ivy League and suddenly realizes that she's very, very out of place. And I think that's an experience a number of law students have, is just feeling out of place. And then you can read this and see like, hey, worked pretty well for her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. So I just like reading these stories because I think that when you hit your own stumbling blocks and when you bring your own individual story to your legal experience, that it can be really helpful to remember these, you know, hyper successful individuals who maybe in these writings have been very honest about what their struggles have been and their failures. And I think that one of the things I appreciated about that book, I think especially around her personal life, she talked a lot about her divorce and was very honest about the part she played in that. And I really appreciated this kind of openness around struggles and failure and pitfalls that were personal and professional. And I think that the more we can kind of talk about that, that stuff, the healthier we are as we move through our own trials and tribulations and struggles.
Yeah, one of the things I remember in the stories from that book, and it has been several years, is when she was buying the jacket. Do you remember when she went shopping with her mother and they were so happy to buy this fancy jacket that she really wanted to wear to school? And she got there and kind of realized like, oh, this really does not fit in. Like, you know, and so it is, you know, it is that thing about kind of playing a role and being authentic, but also, you know, wanting to fit in. And I just thought that was a really interesting discussion in the book.
Yeah. So, you know, worth checking out. Easy read.
Yeah,
good
fun reading.
Fun reading. And clearly memorable because we're talking about it, and I think it was about 4 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, we literally haven't looked at it since.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, actually, there are a number of stories I remember from that book. A lot of, and some of them were more legal related, like some of the early work she was doing about copyright and trademark infringement, and
she worked with fashion designers, didn't she?
Yeah, they'd go down on Canal Street, and so I remember, like, she said in her office she had like all these knockoffs that they bought on Canal Street.
And that experience of kind of going from the Ivy League environment into, these fancy New York law firms was also very
well. And she did not get hired as a summer associate because she felt like she did not fit in on the happy hour test, which we recently talked about with Sadie Jones on a different podcast. But yeah, that feeling of like she didn't feel like she was being hired because she didn't fit what they were looking for in terms of background and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But it worked out okay for her in the end.
She also is very honest about her diabetes and her health struggles around that, which I think for a lot of folks who have kind of chronic health conditions, it can be very inspirational to hear somebody's story of somebody who's able to be at the top of their craft. I think most Supreme Court justices would be considered to be at the top of their craft. We might disagree about a few of them, but that, she's been able to manage that and still, reach excellence. I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's a great book.
It's a great book. Read it. Well, staying on the Supreme Court topic, I love me some Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Well, who doesn't?
She has a few interesting books out. I know her biography has recently come out, and I haven't had a chance to read it yet.
Yeah, I haven't read that either.
But I think it goes along with the movie, which I also haven't gotten to see because when you have small children, you don't get to see as many movies as you used to.
You saw a different Ruth Bader.
I did. The documentary was very good. But one of the books that I really enjoyed was In My Own Words, which is a book on her writing and lectures. And it's just a compilation. So it's something that you can pick up and put down because there's no real story to it. But as an introduction to kind of legal writing, discussing legal issues, I think it's pretty fascinating because you are actually reading some legal writings as well. I think it even has some of her opinions in it, and some lectures where she talks about those opinions. So, especially around, women in the workplace and affirmative action, a lot of the areas that she's very passionate about. And I think that you can learn a lot, especially if you are new to kind of this legal genre. It can be a nice introduction. It'd be like getting to sit and listen to this very famous person give a lot of lectures. And I know you've seen her speak. I haven't seen her speak in person.
I have, yeah. She's a great speaker. So, yeah, I think anything of hers is great. I mean, really, you could pick up probably any book by or about any Supreme Court justice, and it would probably be interesting, and you'd learn something.
That's true.
So,
Although Scalia wrote one that we went to hear Scalia speak, and it was on like legal analysis. I think that one might be a little dense for I was thinking of that one as well. I was like, that probably is not your best choice. Yeah. But something about their biography, their background, that kind of thing. They're all going to be interesting. I mean, you can even pick a classic one. One of the famous people of the past. Read up on them. Can't hurt. All right. So moving into kind of other legal books that are still in our nonfiction realm. The Civil Action, which most people have seen the movie, John Travolta, but the book is also really good. It's by Jonathan Harr. And that story, I think, is really compelling about, what litigation can do to try and help people, but what is challenging about these types of toxic tort litigations. Yeah,
I think there's several books kind of in this genre we're going to talk about of, the kind of courtroom drama. And I think all these, I mean, if you think you want to be a litigator, they're super interesting. And, they're designed to be readable for a layperson. So I think there's, it's something you should probably be able to pick up and get through without a real problem. I mean, if you find yourself bored out of your mind, maybe law school might not be the best choice for you.
That's true.
Or at least not litigation. Might want to think about that. But yeah, I think a Civil Action is great. There's another one we read in my professional responsibility class, which I really enjoyed, called The Buffalo Creek Disaster. And that is also kind of a toxic tort type thing. It's there was a coal mining disaster, and the town people basically brought suit against the coal company. So that one is it goes into a lot of like the procedure and kind of the nuts and bolts of litigation, and it's super interesting.
Yeah, I haven't read that one, but now I kind of want to.
It's really good. Very readable.
Yeah. The problem with doing this podcast is we created this list, and now you and I have a more lengthy reading list.
Exactly.
Even though we're behind on the stuff that we've already promised each other that we're going to read.
Exactly. The list always just keeps growing.
It's so true. All right. Something else that would be a book about kind of a case that you will likely read in law school is called Gideon's Trumpet, which is by Anthony Lewis, and it describes the story behind Gideon versus Wainwright, which is a Supreme Court decision that ruled criminal defendants have a right to attorney even if they cannot afford one. The book is from 1965, but this is a case that is still taught in every law school. I read Gideon, didn't you?
Probably. Yeah, and it's actually, I didn't really know the backstory of it until we were looking at this book yesterday. It's pretty fascinating. It was a pro bono person who actually filed a writ with the Supreme Court in pencil on prison letterhead. And, you can imagine how unusual it is that they would even take that case. And then he won, and established this right to that if you can't afford a lawyer, one will be provided for you. That's like straight up Miranda. Every criminal defendant hears that.
Yep.
So it's kind of an incredible story. I definitely want to read this one. We haven't read it, but it looks fascinating.
Yeah. So also on the list. Maybe we can do a future podcast on it.
Yeah.
One that I didn't put on this list, but we should probably mention is Terminal Ambition, which was written by a friend of ours.
Oh, yeah. That's a good one. That's more of it's a novel.
It's a novel, but about
Kate McGinnis.
Yeah, Kate McGinnis.
Former lawyer and now coach, and she wears many hats.
She wears many hats. Very nice person.
Amazing woman.
But that is about kind of law firm life and issues around sexual harassment. I thought it was very good.
Very good, and also very on point for today.
Yeah, in the Me Too movement.
Exactly. This was pre-Me Too.
This was pre-Me Too. Kind of other legal fiction, kind of maybe in the same realm, like, John Grisham, which a lot of people, consider maybe airplane books or things like that. But, some people really enjoy reading things like The Firm, which is about a rookie tax lawyer and, in his Memphis law firm. And again, like an easy page turner, but it can kind of make you start to think about what it's like to be a young lawyer in some of these types of law firms. So, you can pick up even legal thrillers. They might make you feel a bit better. Did I ever tell you that I kind of did this my summer before law school? I'm just remembering I did this. I tried to read all these different books.
You're such a nerd.
I am such a nerd. So I read the classics on the law school experience, like 1L and The Paper Chase. 1L is by Scott Turow, and it's pretty dated at this point.
Yeah, I think it is dated, in a lot of ways, but at the same time, a lot of it still kind of rings true for people, I think.
Pretty sure I had nightmares after reading 1L, though. It's a little intense.
Yeah, I definitely had to turn off the Paper Chase movie when my roommate and I, for some unfathomable reason, decided we were going to watch this as a study break during finals.
During finals? That's a terrible idea.
We literally got about 5 minutes into it because I think it opens with a very intense scene, and we were like, wow, we should not watch this.
So my contracts professor wrote The Paper Chase.
Wow. Yeah. I never read it. I never looked at it.
Because you were scarred.
Yeah, we're just like, this is not mentally healthy.
Yeah. So, you can learn things from a lot of these different books, but if they're trying to increase your anxiety, feel free to take a step back.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point overall. Sometimes people think like they have to read every single book on, the incoming 1L experience, and they'll get Law School Confidential, and they'll go to Amazon, and they'll get 1L and The Paper Chase, and they'll buy 10 other books and try to read them all. Frankly, all of them probably have some gems in them, but you don't really need to do that.
No. What I kind of think would be a better use of your time, even though I didn't do this when I was getting ready for law school, is spending a little bit of my energy reading things to teach me how to keep my own head on straight and manage, my workflow, kind of how I wanted to be as a person and professional. And so I think, there are books in this genre, and you don't have to read these right before 1L year, but I think that they can kind of help you frame this experience. So the one that we'll have a future podcast on, but that I'm almost done reading, and you're behind on, I believe.
I'm very behind.
It's called Mindsight, which is by Dan Siegel, who's a psychiatrist down out of Southern California. And it's a lot about the power of the mind, about harnessing the power of the mind to, to be able to deal with stress and anxiety and kind of change how your brain works to make you a happier, kind of mentally healthy healthier person. And I think there are a lot of really important things in there. And there was even stories about a 94-year-old lawyer that's pretty fascinating. So I think it's worth it to kind of explore some of these ideas about how you can manage your brain and your anxieties. And he's got something called like the Wheel of Awareness, and you can change your thoughts if you use a practice that's kind of linked to meditation to be able to say, acknowledge your feeling and change, how your thought process is. And that's going to create a physical response in your body. All of this stuff can be used for things like testing anxiety and generalized anxiety around school, or, what do you do when you get bad feedback?
Right. Stress, not sleeping, all these things.
Exactly. So, and just maybe make you a happier person.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think, kind of reading up on that, and there are tons of books and things. I think Mindsight's great. There are plenty of other ones. You can pick up any book on kind of meditation or anything like that. It's probably going to be beneficial if you know nothing about it. There's always the classic Mindset, which we did, I think, one of our very first podcasts on by Carol Dweck, who is a Stanford professor, or was at the time, not sure now. And I think Mindset is a great one because that also, if you're going into this intense educational experience, and often people start feeling like, oh, I'm not smart enough to be here, if they get some negative feedback. And this book is really about how you can turn that around.
And the power you have, to change your mindset, and that you can change these outcomes.
Right. And, that you can actively, I don't want to say fight with your own mind, but basically that's really kind of, you end up almost negotiating with yourself and saying, well, maybe this one piece of negative feedback, which probably isn't really all negative, because we all obviously remember the negative more than the positive. So maybe there were 5 good things that your professor said and 1 bad thing. You think, is that really the case? Like, is everything terrible? And even if it is, like, this doesn't mean I'm going to be a failure. It doesn't mean I'm a terrible person. It doesn't mean I'm stupid. It just means that I haven't learned this skill yet.
Yeah.
And I think turning that around into like, what resources do I need to learn these skills is much more beneficial than just saying, oh, I'm stupid and I'm giving up.
Right. I think that's very true.
So go get Mindset if you talk to yourself like that.
It's true. And even if you don't, I think that law school creates a lot of opportunities to start. So
absolutely. So even if you think that you're good, you might, if you remember midway through the semester.
Right, that you're struggling a little bit.
Yeah, maybe pick up Mindset.
Yeah.
Read it over a coffee. You can skim it or listen to our podcast.
That's right. So we're fans of Cal Newport, who's written a bunch of books. I can't even imagine how many books Cal Newport has written.
I think he started writing them in high school or something. I've met Cal. He's a great guy, but I'm like, wow, you are really very productive.
Yeah, well, maybe that's why he's written books on productivity.
True.
So one of them that you're a big fan of is Deep Work.
Yeah, I think Deep Work is a great book. He has a new one out called Digital Minimalism that I'm just starting, which is what I'm currently reading instead of Mindsight. Sorry. But yeah, Deep Work I think is a really great book. He has another one called So Good They Can't Ignore You. I think either one of these is really valuable for law students because what they're really about is, there's this idea currently of follow your passion and everything will be fine and you build your social media presence and build your brand. And his argument is like, look, that's actually not that valuable. And maybe you shouldn't really follow your passion. Maybe you should find something you're good at that people are willing to pay you well for and do that. And so that's really what So Good They Can't Ignore You is about. And then Deep Work is really about kind of how you basically block out all of the distractions of the modern world and create a space where you can actually do real thinking. And I think that is incredibly valuable for anyone who's going into law school and the legal profession, because what you're really going to get paid for is to think.
Right.
And that's hard these days.
It really is. And, we're coming up on another election year.
Oh, God.
I know.
Already.
It's like never ending. And I think that's just going to make, digital distractions even exponential as far as, news notifications and all of this stuff, a lot of which is some of it's inflammatory. I personally almost always am continuing to try and noodle with different ways to manage technology in my life because I find myself getting into really bad habits. It's so easy.
Yeah, well, these are literally designed to be addictive.
Right. And so we have to actively work against that. So my new thing is I just turned off the email notifications on my phone. So I have to affirmatively check my email, which I still do plenty. It's not like you are waiting to hear from me very often. But I've left our chat.
Right.
I still get notifications for that. But I was like, wow, when I don't know that I'm getting emails, it's like really freeing.
Yeah. And you might think, oh, everyone forgot to send me an email. Awesome.
Exactly. And you know what? The world keeps on moving. If I check my email, like not the minute it goes into my inbox.
Yeah. And I think this is something people really need to think about ahead of time as when they're going into law school, because it is going to be tempting. You're meeting all these new people. You have all these exciting opportunities. And how do you balance that with a need to actually basically cloister yourself in the library and do 3 or 4 hours of deep reading and thinking every single day?
Yeah.
You have to find a way to find that balance, or you're not really going to be able to engage with the material and you're just not going to learn anything.
And one of the biggest complaints we hear from law students when they come to us for help and for tutoring is, I don't know how to manage my time.
Right.
And one of the best ways to manage your time is make the most of the time that you're spending studying. And that does mean like putting away your phone or turning off your internet or whatever you need to do. There are all these, programs you can have on your computer to stop you from searching certain websites so you're not checking Facebook. I mean, whatever accountability structure you have to put into place, I do think that thinking through that over the summer and making some, strategic plans is just going to make your time more valuable.
Yeah, and just being conscious that you need to be doing that deep work every single week. So check out casebooks. They're good.
And then one of our other prolific authors that I think you can pretty much like throw them all on the floor and pick what happened and it'll have value is Brene Brown.
Oh, gotta love Brene.
Gotta love Brene. I just think that you can pretty much learn something from any of her TED Talks, any of her books. Vulnerability, shame, being authentic, leading people. What else does Brene talk about?
Yeah, I think those are kind of the big ones. And I think this is such a big issue for so many people who end up in law school and in the legal profession is they don't want to be dealing with vulnerability. They don't like imperfections and basically just pulling from the titles of her books. They're not necessarily
daring greatly.
They're not daring greatly. They're not necessarily like inspirational leaders. So I think even spending, reading 1 or 2 of these books and just getting a different perspective, I think can actually open up a whole new world where, you start to think like, oh, I am going to be managing people and, oh, I do need to kind of pay attention to myself and maybe I don't have to be perfect all the time. I think the gifts of imperfection is the one that I've given to a lot of lawyer and law school friends because we do feel we have to be perfect. And that whole book is basically about why that is not really realistic or a good idea.
Yeah. She's another person that I think is very authentic and talks about her own personal struggles.
Yeah, I remember I saw a talk by her shortly after The Gifts of Imperfection came out. And she said, well, you might have been there. I got a really nasty email from someone the other day who said to me, like, well, I guess looking like you do, you would give that title.
Oh, I think that was the talk. We saw her and Hillary Clinton. That was a number of years ago.
Yeah. I was just like, wow. Yeah. Wow, that's very rude.
That's very rude. Yeah. Yeah. One more reason to stay off the internet.
Yeah, exactly.
Comments people make.
Don't read the negative comments.
That's right. All right. There's another interesting book that we checked out while we were pulling this list called The End of Lawyers, Rethinking the Nature of Legal Services.
Yeah, and this is Richard Susskind, who, if you have not heard his name and you're thinking of going to law school, you probably want to Google him. Because what he's really thinking about and writing about is, and I mean, it's mostly kind of in the larger law firm models, but not always, is really about how legal services are going to be changing and whether that means fewer lawyers or whether that means lawyers do different things. But he's a really smart guy and he's actually thought about this. So I feel like basically this should be probably required reading for anyone who thinks that they're going to go into private practice before they start law school.
Yeah, I mean, artificial intelligence, document review, how we prep for trial, all that stuff is changing.
Well, just kind of how you deliver legal services. We've had this bespoke model where it was like, oh, we just do your case individually and have a big team working on it. And, that's not really realistic. And then there's also this huge unmet legal need people are not being served. So he's, a serious thinker about what do you do about that problem, both in terms of meeting the legal needs, but also giving lawyers something to do, basically.
Yeah.
So I would highly recommend anything he's written.
So in kind of the legal career space, some other interesting things that you could check out would be 24 Hours with 24 Lawyers, which is by Jasper Kim. And basically he talks to lawyers about what they do all day. We've actually done a lot of blog posts like this where we kind of ask lawyers what a day in the life.
Yeah, and it's always interesting.
So I think that this is something that many people don't have a good idea of, is what lawyers do all day. because I think they get into their first internship or externship or their first time or job and they're like, really? This is what we do?
Right. Well, and also varies a lot across practice areas. I mean, even the difference between being a corporate lawyer and a litigator in private practice, those are very different.
Yeah.
But then, once you expand outside of that, being a public defender or something. I remember my law school roommate describing her first day at work when they basically handed her like 100 case files and were like, oh, you're due in court in 20 minutes. Which is very different from my first day at like a large law firm where they, I don't know, did training for a week.
Right, exactly. Took you to nice lunches.
Yeah, exactly. It's just a different world.
Yeah.
So I think finding out more about what different people do so you can kind of start matching that to what you would like to do or what you think would be a good fit for you can only help you.
That's true. So another book that we think is worth a read is Swimming Lessons for Baby Sharks, which is by Grover Cleveland, who's a friend of the Toolbox.
He is a Toolbox friend.
He's
In
a
fact,
Toolbox friend.
We've done a podcast with him. It's great. He's a great guy. He's completely hysterical.
He is.
And he has basically written this book compiling, tips from attorneys and his own advice that's really designed to help new lawyers be successful and hit the ground running. So I think it's pretty firm focused, but it's also it's very useful really across the board.
And you can even look for some information from us about bar prep in there. We're in the latest edition.
Oh, I was not aware of that.
Yeah, I think maybe I did that without asking you.
Well, I'm sure it's great. It's a good book.
It's great. I think it's important to touch on before we finish up some stuff not to read.
Oh, yeah, please.
Don't watch the paper chase during finals. There are some things that you shouldn't be doing. So we already mentioned casebooks as maybe a terrible waste of time because
I remember I think some big Supreme Court case came out right before I went to law school and I was like, oh, I'm going to sit down and read this opinion. It was like 80 pages long.
Yeah.
I mean, I had no context. I mean, I think I did read it and it was sort of interesting, but it was definitely pretty over my head.
Yeah. And it's important to note that casebooks actually edit those opinions.
Right. That's what I didn't know at the time.
Yeah.
They would take out, the 60 pages of irrelevant stuff that I was slogging through.
Right. That's historic.
Right.
Yeah. So some that are popular that we think are worth skipping for now, especially one that I think is on a lot of lists of stuff to read, is actually Getting to Maybe.
I think that book is too advanced if you haven't started law school. I think I read it at the end of my first semester. I actually, to be honest, I didn't read the entire first part of it. It's kind of divided into two halves. I started trying to read it when I was preparing for exams, which was not a good time to be reading it. And even then, I couldn't really understand it. It wasn't until years later when I was doing a literature review, when I was going to start these websites, and I picked it up and I read it, I'm like, oh, that's what they were saying. Even then, to be honest, I'm not sure I got through the whole book because it's just not the way that I think.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes people pick up Getting to Maybe because it is on a lot of lists, and then they get really intimidated and they feel like, oh, I'm not going to be able to do this. I think just skip it for now.
Yeah. I think you can revisit. But, there's
read
good
it
stuff
over winter break.
Yeah, there's good stuff in there, but I think without a lot of context, it can be too overwhelming. And you don't want to psych yourself out any more than you're already psyched out.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's totally fair. And I think it's just one of those books that's so dense and they just go into so much I just remember reading so much detail about like this thing and this thing and this, like, I mean, even now, I'm not sure I actually could understand everything they're saying. And we've read a lot of books about this sort of thing.
So I think another thing people talk about doing over the summer is reading hornbooks.
Yeah.
So Alison, what is a hornbook? If you're a pre-law, you may not know.
Well, so a hornbook is basically kind of like a Cliff Note version of the law. It's kind of a summary.
But it's not like Cliff Notes, like 20 pages.
No, it's like 1,000 pages.
Right, exactly.
I mean, they're condensing down, 10,000 pages to 1,000 pages.
Right.
And hornbooks are really mostly used by actual practicing attorneys. So that's who it's geared toward. It's not the sort of thing you can just pick up and read from cover to cover. I mean, you would never do that, even if you're practicing. You basically dive in, you find the topic you need to learn about, and you read 10 pages, and then you go do some research. It's just not the sort of thing that you sit down and read. And sometimes people think they should, and that's kind of ridiculous. I mean, it's just going to be a waste of time. You have no idea. You probably don't even know what classes you're taking first semester at this point. You definitely don't know what your torts professor is going to cover. it's just going to confuse you.
I think that is a point that a lot of pre-law or 0L students don't understand, is that, even if you are taking a 4-unit class on contracts, they are not going to cover everything in the universe.
They're going to cover like 1% of the potential hornbook.
And the professors get to pick and choose what that is. So is everybody going to talk about offer and acceptance? Sure.
I would hope so.
One would hope so. Damages, yes. But there are a lot of kind of tiny nuances that professors are going to leave out because they do have to do so for the sake of time. That's also why they're not going to assign you typically cover to cover of the casebook. Because
never. They're going to, they have to edit.
They have to edit. And so if you do this kind of deep dive into these subject areas and try to immerse yourself in the law, it's also possible that you're going to be studying things that are not going to be applicable for your class. And trust me, your professor's not going to be impressed if you talk about stuff that wasn't covered in class on the exam. They're actually going to be like, we didn't talk about it. Don't include it.
Yeah, and I think you can just confuse yourself. You can think you learned something in class, but really you learned it over the summer. I feel kind of the same way about commercial outlines. In terms of don't read hornbooks. Second, probably don't read commercial outlines, which are shorter than hornbooks and designed for law students. And then the third, probably don't read, but if you really have to do it, here's where I would probably go, are the examples and explanation series. Yeah. And so all of these are, all three of these things are about substantive law, but they're kind of in decreasing order of easiness. So, if you insist that you must try to learn something about tort law, which we don't think you need to, pick up the E&E on torts. If nothing else, you'll probably need it for your torts class anyway, so you may as well buy it. Yeah. But there is literally no reason for you to be reading this over the summer.
No, there's plenty of time to read this stuff during the school year. You do not need to read it over the summer.
If you want to read a case, you can do our Start Law School Right course, and we will walk you through how to read an actual case. Yes. In fact, it will probably show up in your torts class. And we'll also help you with all the other aspects of law school. So do that instead.
Yep. All right. Well, I think we're out of time, but that's a lot to read. So
you've got definitely a pretty long reading list at this point.
But before we finish up, I know you just mentioned our Start Law School Right course, and I wanted to let people know where they can check that out, which is shockingly enough on our website at lawschooltoolbox.com/startlawschoolright. This on-demand course, which includes feedback from one of our amazing Law School Toolbox tutors, will help you understand how to excel in law school from day one. So check it out and feel free to contact us if you have any questions. The nice thing about this course is it can be done at your convenience, so it's a great option for those of you who are working but also want to do a little prep for law school. All right, now if you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app. We'd really appreciate it, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Allison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.